September 16, 2023. The afternoon sun was filtering through the narrow streets of Saint-Ouen as 88-year-old Alain Delon made his way slowly through the famous Marché aux Puces, Paris's legendary flea market. Dressed in a simple gray sweater and dark trousers, leaning slightly on a wooden walking cane, he looked like any other elderly gentleman enjoying a quiet browse through the maze of antique stalls and vintage shops. For most people, a visit to the flea market was about hunting for bargains or discovering forgotten treasures. But for Alain, these visits had become something more profound, a way of encountering his own legacy from the outside, seeing how his life's work was being preserved, valued, and remembered by collectors and fans who had no idea they were in the presence of the man himself. At 88, Alain had learned to appreciate the anonymity that age had granted him. Gone were the days when his appearance anywhere would cause crowds to gather and cameras to flash. Now he could move through the world like any other person, observing rather than being observed, listening rather than being listened to. It was this invisibility that had led him to one of his favorite pastimes, browsing through shops that specialized in cinema memorabilia, watching as dealers and collectors discussed his films, his performances, and his place in movie history as if he were some distant historical figure rather than a living person standing just a few feet away. On this particular afternoon, Alain found himself drawn to a small shop called Cinema Vintage that specialized in movie posters, photographs, and signed memorabilia from the golden age of European cinema. The shop was owned by Henri Dubois, a 45-year-old dealer who had built his reputation on having access to some of the rarest and most valuable pieces of film history. Henri prided himself on being an expert in the field, particularly when it came to French cinema of the 1960s and 70s. His shop was filled with carefully preserved posters, lobby cards, and signed photographs, all meticulously catalogued and priced according to their rarity and cultural significance. As Alain entered the shop, Henri barely looked up from the inventory sheet he was updating. The old man with the walking cane appeared to be just another casual browser, the kind of customer who might spend an hour looking through the displays without buying anything significant. Alain moved slowly through the shop, his eyes scanning the familiar faces that looked back at him from movie posters and publicity stills. There were images from Breathless, Jules and Jim, The 400 Blows, the films that had defined the French New Wave and changed cinema forever. And scattered throughout were posters and photographs from his own films, pieces of his life and career, now preserved behind glass and offered for sale like artifacts from an ancient civilization. It was near the back of the shop that Alain saw it, a pristine original poster from Le Samouraï, the 1967 Jean-Pierre Melville masterpiece that many critics considered his finest performance. The poster showed him in his iconic pose, fedora tilted at a precise angle, trench coat collar turned up, cigarette dangling from his lips, eyes conveying the cool professionalism and tragic loneliness that had made Jeff Costello one of cinema's most memorable characters. But what drew Alain's attention wasn't just the poster itself, it was the signature in the bottom right corner. His own signature, written in the distinctive style he had used in the late 1960s, when he was still young enough to believe that signing autographs was a minor inconvenience rather than a privilege. The memory came flooding back as he stared at the familiar handwriting. It was 1967, just after the film's premiere at the Cannes Film Festival. A young journalist had approached him at the after-party, asking him to sign the poster for her private collection. He had been in a good mood that night, pleased with the film's reception and feeling generous toward the press. The signature had taken him perhaps 30 seconds to complete, a casual gesture that he had forgotten almost immediately. Now, 56 years later, that casual signature was being offered for sale with a price tag that made Alain's eyes widen: 50,000 euros.
Interested in that piece? Henri's voice came from behind him, carrying a tone that suggested he had already assessed this elderly customer's purchasing power and found it wanting. Alain turned slowly, his face carefully neutral. "It's quite striking," he said quietly. Henri moved closer, assuming the role of the expert educating an amateur. "That's an original 1967 Le Samurai poster, signed by Alain Delon himself. Museum quality, absolutely authentic. One of only a handful known to exist with his genuine signature from that period."
"How can you be certain the signature is authentic?" Alain asked, genuinely curious about Henri's authentication methods. Henri's expression took on the condescending tone of someone who dealt regularly with customers who questioned his expertise. "I've been dealing in cinema memorabilia for 20 years. I know a real Delon signature when I see one. The formation of the A, the way he crosses the L in Alain, the flourish on the end in Delon. It's all exactly right for his signing style from that era." Alain nodded thoughtfully, impressed despite himself by Henri's detailed knowledge of his own handwriting. "And the price?" 50,000 euros, Henri said, his tone suggesting that this was obviously far beyond the means of the elderly man in front of him. "It's a serious collector's piece. Delon memorabilia has been appreciating steadily, especially items from his iconic films. This poster represents not just a piece of cinema history, but a solid investment." Alain continued studying the poster, remembering not just the moment he had signed it, but the entire experience of making the film. He could recall the weight of the fedora on his head, the feel of the trench coat across his shoulders, the precise way Melville had directed each scene to create the atmosphere of cool professionalism that had made the film a masterpiece. "He was quite young when this film was made," Alain observed. 32, Henri replied automatically. "At the height of his powers, really. Le Samurai is considered by many to be his finest performance. The character of Jeff Costello became iconic, the perfect assassin, professional but ultimately tragic." There was something surreal about hearing his own career analyzed by someone who had no idea he was talking to the subject of his expertise. Alain found himself both amused and slightly melancholy at the way his past was being packaged and sold as historical artifact. "I suppose I couldn't afford something like this," Alain said, more as a statement than a question. Henri's response was immediate and dismissive. "I'm afraid not. This is serious collecting, not casual browsing. The authentication alone cost me several thousand euros. Items like this go to museums, private collections, serious investors. It's not the sort of thing you pick up on a whim." The condescension in Henri's voice was unmistakable. He had made his assessment of this elderly customer and found him to be exactly the sort of person who would waste his time looking at expensive items he could never afford to purchase. Alain was quiet for a long moment, still staring at his own signature from 5 decades earlier. When he finally spoke, his voice was soft but clear. "You're absolutely right about the authenticity," he said. "I remember signing this poster. It was at the Cannes after-party, 1967. A young journalist asked for my autograph. I was wearing a black tuxedo, and I had to be careful not to drip champagne on the poster while I signed it." Henri's expression shifted from condescension to confusion. "Excuse me?" Alain turned to face him fully, and for the first time, Henri really looked at the elderly man's face. The bone structure was still there, the distinctive cheekbones and the penetrating eyes, though both were softened by age. The voice, though quieter than it had been in his film roles, carried the same distinctive cadence that had captivated audiences for 6 decades. "I'm Alain Delon," he said simply, "and that's my signature on your poster." The silence that followed was complete.
Henri stared at Alain's face, his mind racing to reconcile the elderly man in front of him with the iconic figure whose career he had been describing moments before. Slowly, recognition dawned, and with it came a flush of embarrassment that started at his collar and spread rapidly upward. "Oh my God," Henri whispered. "Oh my God, I'm so sorry. You look different. I never expected." Alain smiled gently. "It has been 56 years since that poster was made. We all look different."
Henri was clearly mortified, struggling to find words that might somehow undo the condescending attitude he had displayed toward one of the most legendary actors in cinema history. "Monsieur Delon, please, I had no idea. I'm a huge admirer of your work. Le Samouraï is one of my favorite films. I've probably watched it 100 times." "And yet you didn't recognize the man who played Jeff Costello," Alain observed, though his tone held no malice. It's just that you were so young in the films, and now—" Henri trailed off, realizing that anything he said about Alain's appearance would only make the situation worse. Other customers in the shop had begun to notice the conversation, drawn by Henri's obvious distress and the increasingly animated nature of the discussion. Word began to spread quickly through the small space that the elderly man examining the Les Samouraï poster was actually Alain Delon himself. Within minutes, a small crowd had gathered, with people pulling out phones to take pictures and others simply staring in amazement at the living legend who had been browsing anonymously through the shop. The irony was not lost on anyone. The man who had been told he couldn't afford an item bearing his own signature was in fact the person who had created that signature's value in the first place. Henri continued his attempts at damage control, offering profuse apologies and trying to explain his expertise in authenticating signatures, as if this might somehow excuse his failure to recognize the person who had created the signature he claimed to know so well. "The poster is beautiful," Alain said finally, cutting through Henri's stammered explanations. "You've preserved it well. I hope it finds its way to someone who will appreciate both the film and the work that went into making it." As news of the encounter began to spread beyond the shop, social media posts started appearing with photos of Alain examining his own poster. The story quickly went viral, with users sharing images and videos of the legendary actor being told he couldn't afford his own memorabilia. The incident became a perfect example of how assumptions about age, appearance, and social class can lead to embarrassing mistakes. Comments poured in from around the world, with people expressing both amusement at Henri's error and admiration for Alain's gracious handling of the situation. Henri, once he recovered from his initial shock, proved to be genuinely contrite about his mistake. He offered to give Alain the poster as a gesture of apology, but Alain politely declined, suggesting instead that Henri continue to treat it as the valuable piece of cinema history it was. The story at Cinema Vintage became one of the most shared celebrity encounter stories of 2023, serving as both entertainment and gentle lesson about the importance of treating all people with respect, regardless of their appearance or perceived circumstances.
The video footage captured by other customers quickly spread across social media platforms, with different aspects of the story resonating with different audiences. On TikTok, younger users were amazed to learn about Alain's legendary status, many discovering his films for the first time through the viral incident. Instagram posts focused on the visual contrast between the aging legend and his iconic movie posters, while Twitter users engaged in broader discussions about ageism and celebrity culture. The story also caught the attention of film scholars and critics, who used it as a starting point for discussions about how cinema history is preserved and commodified. Several articles were written analyzing the irony of a living legend being priced out of his own legacy, and what this said about the relationship between artists and the commercial value of their work. Henri's shop experienced an unprecedented surge in visitors following the incident. People came not just to buy memorabilia, but to see the location where the famous encounter had taken place. Henri, initially embarrassed by his newfound internet fame, eventually embraced the opportunity to share his genuine passion for cinema history with a much larger audience. The poster itself became even more valuable after the incident, though Henri decided not to sell it immediately. Instead, he displayed it prominently with a plaque explaining the story of Alain's visit, turning it into a kind of shrine to the unexpected encounter between past and present. Film festivals around the world began incorporating the story into retrospectives of Alain's work, using it to illustrate how the relationship between artists and their audiences evolves over time. The incident became a teaching tool for discussions about celebrity, aging, and the assumptions we make about people based on their appearance. Henri, for his part, learned a valuable lesson about assumptions and customer service. He later reported that the incident had actually been good for business, with collectors and film fans seeking out his shop specifically because of its connection to the viral story. More importantly, he changed his approach to customer interactions, making an effort to treat every visitor with the same level of respect, regardless of their appearance or apparent purchasing power. The broader cultural impact of the story continued to unfold in the months following the incident. Age advocacy groups used it to highlight the issue of ageism in society, pointing out how older adults are often dismissed or ignored based on assumptions about their relevance or capabilities. The story became a rallying cry for better treatment of elderly people in all aspects of society, from retail interactions to healthcare to employment. For collectors of cinema memorabilia, the incident sparked discussions about the ethics of profiting from artists' work, particularly when those artists are still living. Some began questioning whether it was appropriate to charge such high prices for signatures and memorabilia when the people who created them might not be able to afford their own legacy items. The story also influenced how other celebrities approach their own encounters with memorabilia dealers and collectors. Several actors reported being inspired by Alain's gracious handling of the situation, using it as a model for how to respond to awkward or embarrassing encounters with dignity and humor. If this incredible tale of assumptions, embarrassment, and gracious celebrity behavior entertained you, make sure to subscribe and share this video with someone who needs a reminder that you never know who you might be talking to. Tell us in the comments about a time when you or someone you know was underestimated based on appearances, because sometimes the most extraordinary people are hiding in plain sight, waiting to remind us that true greatness doesn't always announce itself.